Imagine being 13 years old, falsely accused, and thrown into a system designed to break you. But instead of giving up, he fought back. A corrupt judge, a hidden conspiracy, and a truth so dangerous, it could bring down an entire empire. This isn't just a fight for justice, it's a war for the truth. And Jamal Carter? He's just getting started. Jamal Carter had always known the world wasn't fair, but he never imagined he'd learn that lesson in handcuffs. At 13, he had his sights set on a future bigger than the small apartment he shared with his mother in Birmingham, Alabama. He wasn't just smart, he was sharp, quick-witted, a kid who devoured legal textbooks while other kids were playing video games. He wanted to be a lawyer one day, someone who could stand in a courtroom and make sure that people like him, people who looked like him, had a chance at justice. His mother, Lorraine Carter, had worked her whole life to give him opportunities she never had. That's why she pushed him to accept the scholarship to St. Augustine Academy, a prestigious private school where almost every student came from old money. It was supposed to be his ticket to something better. Instead, it had become a battlefield. Jamal was one of only a handful of black students at St. Augustine. And he felt that weight every day. It was in the way some teachers looked past him when he raised his hand, in the way certain parents whispered when he walked by, in the way kids like Ethan Whitmore, privileged, untouchable, treated him like he didn't belong. Ethan wasn't just any rich kid. He was the son of Judge Charles Whitmore, a man who had spent decades building his reputation as a hardliner in the courtroom. And Ethan had inherited his father's talent for manipulation. That afternoon, Jamal was heading to the library when he heard Ethan's voice behind him. "Hey, scholarship boy," Ethan called out, loud enough for the hallway to go quiet. Jamal sighed, gripping the strap of his backpack. He wasn't in the mood. He had an essay to finish, and dealing with Ethan was a waste of time. "Not today, Whitmore," Jamal said, keeping his stride. But Ethan wasn't interested in letting him walk away. He stepped in front of Jamal, a smirk on his face, his friends gathering behind him like a pack of hyenas. "What's the rush?" Ethan taunted. "Got a meeting with your parole officer?" A few of his friends laughed. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he kept his face blank. That was the thing about guys like Ethan. They wanted a reaction. They fed off it. "Move," Jamal said evenly. Ethan tilted his head. "Make me." Jamal didn't move. He wasn't stupid. He knew how this played out. If he shoved Ethan aside, it wouldn't matter that Ethan started it. It wouldn't matter that Ethan was the one getting in his face. But before he could step around him, Ethan suddenly shoved him, hard. Jamal stumbled back, barely catching himself before hitting the lockers. The moment he regained his balance, Ethan grabbed his own stomach and dropped to the floor, letting out an exaggerated groan. The hallway erupted in gasps. "What the hell?" Jamal stared at him in disbelief. One of Ethan's friends rushed forward. "Dude, he totally punched you." Jamal's heart sank as more voices chimed in. "I saw it too. He attacked Ethan for no reason." It happened so fast that Jamal barely had time to process it. Teachers came running. Within seconds, Ethan was sitting on the ground, clutching his stomach like he'd been assaulted. Jamal tried to explain. "I didn't touch him." But the teachers weren't listening. The school dean, Mr. Calloway, pushed through the crowd, his eyes scanning the scene. "What is going on here?" Ethan's friend spoke up first, his voice filled with just the right amount of outrage. "Jamal attacked Ethan. We all saw it." Jamal's stomach twisted. "That's a lie." But Mr. Calloway didn't even hesitate. "Carter, my office, now." Jamal sat in the dean's office, his hands clenched into fists. His mind raced, trying to figure out a way to prove the truth. There had to be cameras. Someone had to have seen what really happened. Mr. Calloway sat behind his desk, arms crossed. "You have been given an incredible opportunity here at St. Augustine, Jamal, and this is how you repay it?" "I didn't do anything," Jamal said through gritted teeth. "That's not what the witnesses say." "Those witnesses are Ethan's friends." Jamal shot back. "They're lying." Before Mr. Calloway could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. A police officer stepped inside. Jamal's pulse stuttered. "This is Officer Daniels," Mr. Calloway said. "Due to the serious nature of this incident, we have informed the authorities." Jamal's mouth went dry. This couldn't be happening. The officer glanced at Jamal, then pulled out a notepad. We received a report of an assault. Ethan Whitmore's father has pressed charges. Jamal's breath caught. Judge Whitmore, of course. You're making a mistake, Jamal said. Officer Daniels didn't look convinced. Well, kid, that's not up to me. The door swung open again. And this time, it was his mother. Lorraine Carter's face was a mask of controlled fury. She locked eyes with her son, then turned to the officer. You have got to be kidding me. Ma'am, your son has been accused of assault. We're taking him in for questioning. Lorraine's voice was steady, but Jamal could hear the anger simmering beneath it. You're arresting a 13-year-old? Over a lie? Officer Daniels shrugged. We're just following procedure. Jamal swallowed hard as the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. No, Lorraine snapped. He's a minor. You don't. But Daniels was already reaching for Jamal's wrists. Jamal barely registered the murmurs of students outside the office window. The way some of them laughed. The way others just stared. Some with curiosity, others with pity. He looked at his mother. At the fire in her eyes. They won't let you go easy, she whispered. Jamal turned back to Officer Daniels. His voice quiet but unwavering. I didn't do anything. The officer gave him a patronizing smile as he tightened the cuffs. Kid, he said, that's not how the system works. And just like that, Jamal Carter, who had dreamed of becoming a lawyer, was led out of his school in handcuffs. Jamal sat stiffly in the back of the police car, his wrists still aching from the cold metal of the handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights reflected against the tinted windows as they drove through the streets of Birmingham. His mother wasn't allowed to ride with him. The last thing he saw before they pulled away was Lorraine Carter standing on the school steps. Her hands clenched into fists, her face a storm of rage and fear. The officers up front didn't speak to him. The car smelled like stale coffee and sweat, and every bump in the road made the handcuffs dig into his skin. Jamal forced himself to take slow, steady breaths. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. He was supposed to be at home tonight, working on his homework, not sitting in the back of a police car like some criminal. But reality was settling in fast. When they pulled up to the station, Officer Daniels yanked the door open and motioned for Jamal to step out. The station was smaller than he expected, worn-out brick walls, flickering fluorescent lights. A few officers milled about, barely glancing at him as he was led inside. I need to see my mom, Jamal said as they walked past the front desk. Daniels didn't even look at him. Jamal's pulse quickened. I have a right to a lawyer. Daniels let out a chuckle. Sure you do, kid. He led Jamal down a hallway and into a small interrogation room with no windows. Have a seat. Jamal hesitated. Daniels exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. Sit. Jamal sat. The room smelled like disinfectant and old paper. The table was scratched, probably from years of people gripping its edge too hard. He could hear voices outside, officers laughing, phones ringing. The world was moving on as if nothing was happening, as if his life wasn't crumbling by the second. Then the door swung open, and Victor Harrison stepped inside. Jamal had never met the man before, but he knew the type. Harrison had the look of someone who was used to people listening when he spoke, salt and pepper hair. An expensive suit that didn't quite fit the dingy atmosphere of the room. He carried himself like he was above all this, like stepping into this station was an inconvenience. Harrison dropped a folder onto the table and took a seat across from Jamal. Lacing his fingers together, Jamal Carter, he said, dragging out the name like he was trying it on for size. You know who I am? Jamal didn't answer. Harrison smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. I'm the prosecutor on your case. That means I get to decide how much of a problem this little incident becomes for you. Jamal sat up straighter. I didn't do anything. Harrison sighed like he'd heard this excuse 1,000 times. That's not what the witnesses say. He opened the folder and pulled out a printed report. According to multiple students, you attacked Ethan Whitmore unprovoked. Jamal clenched his jaw. They're lying. Harrison leaned back in his chair. Here's the thing, kid. The law doesn't care what you think happened. It cares about evidence. And right now, the evidence is stacked against you. Jamal felt his stomach tighten. There are cameras in that hallway. Check the footage. Harrison's smile widened. Oh, We already did. He slid a blurry, black and white screenshot across the table. It showed Ethan on the ground, holding his stomach. Jamal was in the frame, standing nearby, but it didn't show what really happened. It didn't show Ethan throwing himself onto the floor. That's not proof, Jamal said. Harrison shrugged. It's enough. He leaned forward. Now, I'm going to make you an offer. Plead guilty to simple assault. You'll get probation, maybe some community service. It'll be a slap on the wrist. Jamal's heart pounded. I'm not pleading guilty. Harrison's expression darkened. Think carefully, Jamal. If you fight this, you're looking at juvie. You'll lose your scholarship, your future. Poof. Gone. Do you really want to take that risk? Jamal swallowed hard. His throat felt dry. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a warning. I want my lawyer, he said. Harrison's smile returned, but it was sharper now, edged with something almost amused. That's cute, he said, standing up. You don't have one. Jamal's fingers curled into fists. He was trapped. They kept him in holding overnight. He barely slept. By the time they brought him to court the next morning, his body ached from the stiff plastic bench. His mother was already there, sitting in the front row, her face pale but set with determination. He met her eyes, and she gave him the slightest nod. Then his gaze shifted to the judge's bench. Judge Charles Whitmore. Jamal's stomach twisted. Ethan's father. Of course. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and peered down at Jamal like he was something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Jamal Carter, he said, you have been charged with assault. How do you plead? Jamal swallowed the lump in his throat. Not guilty. Whitmore let out a small hum. Like he wasn't surprised. He glanced at Harrison, then back at Jamal. I see. Jamal straightened his shoulders. I'd like to request a lawyer. Whitmore's mouth twitched. That's your right, he said, but since you've chosen not to accept the deal offered to you, I see no reason to release you on bail. Jamal's breath hitched. Wait. The court orders that Jamal Carter be remanded to juvenile detention until trial. The gavel slammed down. His mother shot to her feet. You can't do this. He's a child. Whitmore didn't even look at her. The officers moved in. Jamal barely had time to process what was happening before they grabbed his arms, pulling him toward the exit. He struggled, his heart pounding. This isn't fair. Whitmore just smiled, calm and composed. Life isn't fair, son. That night, Sophia Bennett, an investigative journalist, sat in her apartment, flipping through the case file she had just received. Something about this didn't sit right. She had seen too many cases like this before. Cases where the system chewed up kids like Jamal and spit them out. She picked up her phone and dialed. Lorraine Carter, she said when the line clicked. I think I can help your son. Across town, Elijah Green sat at his desk, staring at his laptop screen. He wasn't a hacker, not really, but he knew his way around a system. He pulled up the school's security database. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Come on, he muttered. There has to be something. Then he found it. A video file. The real footage. Elijah's pulse quickened as he clicked download. A message popped up on his screen. Access denied. Then another. Unauthorized attempt detected. The screen flickered. And then, the file disappeared. Jamal sat on his cot in the detention center, staring at the ceiling. The walls were bare, the air thick with silence. His mind replayed everything. Ethan's smirk, Harrison's threats, Whitmore's gavel slamming down. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. Jamal clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let them win. Jamal lay on the stiff cot, staring at the ceiling of his cell. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and old concrete. The walls cold and unwelcoming. He had spent the last few hours in silence, his mind racing between disbelief and fury. This wasn't supposed to be happening. He had always believed that if he worked hard, followed the rules, and stayed out of trouble, he could make it. But here he was, locked up like a criminal for something he didn't do. Sleep never came. He sat up when he heard footsteps approaching. A guard unlocked the door, nodding for him to follow. Visitor. The man grunted. Jamal's stomach twisted. His mother. As soon as he stepped into the visitation room, he spotted her sitting at the metal table. Lorraine Carter looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, her shoulders tense. She wasn't a woman who cried easily. but Jamal saw the streaks on her cheeks. The moment he sat down, she reached for his hands, gripping them tightly. "Baby," she whispered, "are you okay?" Jamal swallowed hard. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to reassure her. But nothing about this was okay. "They want me to plead guilty," he said instead. His voice was hoarse, raw. "If I take the deal, I'll be on house arrest." Lorraine stiffened. "And if you don't?" Jamal looked down at the table. "Juvie." His mother let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around his. "We're getting you out of here. I promise." Jamal wanted to believe her. But after what he had seen yesterday, the way Judge Whitmore barely even looked at him before deciding his fate, he wasn't sure anyone could help him. "I'm scared, Ma," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if I never get out?" Lorraine cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Don't you dare think like that," she said fiercely. "You are not a criminal. You are my son, and we are going to fight this." Before Jamal could respond, the guard tapped on the door. "Time's up." Lorraine stood abruptly. "I love you, baby." Jamal held onto her gaze as long as he could before the door shut between them. He had never felt so powerless in his life. Back in his cell, Jamal wasn't alone. A man sat on the opposite cot, watching him with an unreadable expression. He was older, mid-40s maybe, with deep-set eyes and a tired face. "You're new," the man said after a long pause. Jamal nodded, leaning against the wall. The man studied him for a moment. "What they got you in for?" Jamal hesitated, then sighed. "Something I didn't do." The man huffed a quiet laugh. "That's what they all say." Jamal bristled. "Yeah, well, in my case, it's true." The man didn't argue. He just watched Jamal a little longer before finally saying, "Name's Darnell Hayes." Jamal frowned. The name sounded familiar. Darnell must have seen the recognition on his face. "I was in the news a few years back. Wrongful conviction. Spent 15 years locked up for a crime I didn't commit." Jamal's stomach dropped. "How'd you get out?" he asked. Darnell's expression darkened. "Took a miracle." He leaned forward. "Listen, kid, you think the truth is enough? That if you just tell them what really happened, they'll believe you?" Jamal didn't answer. Darnell smirked. "They don't care about the truth. They care about making things easy. And you're an easy target." Jamal clenched his fists. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let them ruin my life?" Darnell's eyes sharpened. "No, you fight. But you fight smart. If you let them define you, you've already lost." Jamal held onto those words long after Darnell stopped talking. Maybe he wasn't as powerless as he thought. The next morning, Jamal was led back to the interrogation room. Victor Harrison was already waiting for him, the same smug expression on his face. "I assume you've had time to think," he said smoothly. Jamal didn't respond. Harrison slid a paper across the table. "Here's the deal. Plead guilty. You'll get house arrest, some probation, and this all goes away." Jamal stared at the paper, then at Harrison. "I'm not guilty." Harrison exhaled sharply, as if he were dealing with a stubborn child. "If you don't take this, you'll go to trial. And let me be clear, Judge Whitmore will make sure you regret that decision." Jamal met his gaze head on. "I want my lawyer." Harrison chuckled, shaking his head. "Fine, have it your way." Lorraine had managed to find a public defender. His name was Marcus Bell, and from the moment he walked into the room, Jamal knew this man wasn't going to help him. Bell barely glanced up from his folder. "Listen, kid, I'll be straight with you. You're facing an uphill battle. The judge isn't on your side, and the DA is pushing hard." Jamal folded his arms. "So what do we do?" Bell sighed. "We take the deal." Jamal's jaw tightened. "I didn't do anything." Bell shrugged. "Doesn't matter. You take the deal. You go home. You fight this, and you could be in juvie for years." Lorraine's hands trembled. "Aren't you supposed to defend him?" Bell looked at her like she was naive. "Ma'am, I'm just being realistic. Your son is a black kid accused of assaulting a judge's son. No one is going to believe him." Jamal stared at him, disbelief boiling into something sharper. Bell didn't see a kid who deserved justice. He saw a case to close as quickly as possible. "You don't care," Jamal said. Bell chuckled. "Welcome to the real world, kid." Jamal exhaled slowly, his heart hammering. "Then I'll do it myself." he said. Bell raised a brow. Do what? Jamal sat up straighter. I'll defend myself. Bell laughed. Actually laughed. You think you're a lawyer now? Jamal's eyes didn't waver. Not yet. Bell shook his head. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Lorraine looked at her son with a mixture of fear and pride. Baby, are you sure? Jamal nodded. He didn't know how, but he would find a way. He wasn't going to let them decide his fate. Sophia Bennett had seen enough corruption in her career to know when something smelled rotten. The moment she read about Jamal Carter's case, something didn't sit right. A black kid from a working-class family accused of attacking the son of a judge? A trial being rushed without solid evidence? It had all the hallmarks of a setup. She sat in her car outside St. Augustine Academy, flipping through the notes she had gathered so far. Her instincts told her the real story wasn't in the court filings or the police reports. It was in the details that had been conveniently overlooked. Her phone buzzed. You still digging into this case? The voice on the other end asked. Sophia smirked. You know me, Alex. I don't let things go. Alex Connolly was a former cop turned private investigator. Someone who had sources in places she couldn't reach. Be careful, he warned. I did some checking. That school security footage? It's been tampered with. Sophia's grip on the steering wheel tightened. You're sure? Positive. Someone edited it to make it look like Jamal attacked Ethan. Sophia exhaled slowly. This wasn't just a simple case of racial bias. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to frame this kid. She glanced toward the school. If the footage had been altered, then there had to be an original version somewhere, and she had a pretty good idea of who could find it. Elijah Green wasn't a hacker in the way Hollywood made them seem. No dark hoodies or neon screens filled with scrolling code. He was just a kid who spent too much time tinkering with computers. And right now, he was Jamal's best shot at finding the truth. Sitting in his cluttered bedroom, he cracked his knuckles and got to work. The school's security system wasn't exactly Fort Knox. Within minutes, he was inside, sifting through files. Come on, he muttered, scanning the footage logs. Then, there it was. A video file labeled with the timestamp of the incident. His pulse quickened as he clicked to download it. The file bar began filling. But just as it hit 60%, the screen flashed red. Access denied. Elijah frowned. He tried again. Unauthorized attempt detected. Locking system. Then his screen went black. Someone had just shut him out. He stared at the monitor, his stomach twisting. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a school trying to protect its students. This was someone actively covering their tracks. He grabbed his phone and called Jamal's mom. Mrs. Carter, we have a problem. Victor Harrison took a slow sip of his coffee as he reviewed the case file. Everything was moving according to plan. The trial was set, and with Whitmore presiding, there was no way the kid would walk free. His phone buzzed. They tried accessing the footage. A voice said. Harrison smirked. Let me guess, Green? Yeah, he got close, but we locked it before he could pull the full file. Harrison leaned back in his chair. Good, make sure it stays that way. He ended the call and picked up a different phone. The secure one. I assume you've been following the case, he said after the line clicked. A deep voice responded. Of course. Harrison chose his words carefully. There's been interference. A journalist and a tech-savvy friend of the defendant. They're looking where they shouldn't. A pause. Then, handle it. The call ended. Harrison smiled to himself. Jamal Carter didn't stand a chance. Ethan Whitmore sat in his father's office, listening as Judge Charles Whitmore ended his own phone call. Ethan had known from the start that his dad had ways of making problems disappear. But this time felt different. Are they still fighting it? He asked. Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temples. Of course they are, but it doesn't matter. The case is already decided. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Dad, what if we're pushing too hard? His father's eyes snapped to him. Excuse me? Ethan hesitated. He didn't like Jamal, but he also didn't think the kid deserved to have his life ruined. He had assumed this would blow over, that Jamal would get a slap on the wrist and move on. But now, with all the secrecy and the phone calls in hushed tones, it was starting to feel wrong. You sure he actually hit me? Ethan asked, his voice quieter. Whitmore's expression darkened. That doesn't matter. Ethan swallowed. This isn't just about Jamal. Whitmore continued. This is about maintaining order. If we let this go, it sends the wrong message. People need to know that some lines can't be crossed. Ethan wasn't sure what to say. His father had always been in control. But for the first time, Ethan wondered if maybe, just maybe, his dad wasn't as untouchable as he thought. Sophia sat in her apartment, listening to the audio file Alex had sent her. It was grainy, but the words were clear enough. Harrison is getting impatient, a voice said. Make sure the kid doesn't win. She rewound it, listening again. The voice was unfamiliar, but the meaning was crystal clear. Someone had given the order to bury Jamal. She picked up her phone and called Elijah. Meet me tomorrow, she said. We just found our smoking gun. Jamal sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the cracked ceiling of the detention center. He had spent the past few days replaying everything in his head, every word, every action, every moment that led him here. But now, something was different. He wasn't just a scared kid anymore. He wasn't just someone caught in a system too big for him to fight. They thought they could bury him. They thought he would break. But they were wrong. Jamal smirked to himself. They weren't ready for what was coming next. Jamal Carter had never felt a room this heavy before. The courtroom wasn't just filled with lawyers and judges, it was filled with power. The kind of power that didn't like to be questioned. The kind that crushed people like him before they even had a chance to fight back. He stood at the defendant's table, his hands gripping the edge tightly. Across the room, Victor Harrison sat with a calm, practiced smile, tapping a pen against his file as if this was just another easy case. And above them all, behind his towering bench, Judge Charles Whitmore leaned back in his chair, regarding Jamal with something between amusement and boredom. So, Whitmore drawled, I'm told the defendant has requested to represent himself. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The few reporters in attendance perked up. This wasn't something they saw every day. Harrison let out a quiet chuckle. Your Honor, while I appreciate the boy's enthusiasm, we can't seriously entertain this. He turned to Jamal, his voice dripping with condescension. You're 13. Do you even understand the rules of evidence? Jamal met his gaze without blinking. I understand them better than my own lawyer. Who told me to plead guilty to something I didn't do? The murmur grew louder. Whitmore sighed and looked at Jamal like he was some stubborn child refusing to admit he'd lost. Son, do you think this is a game? Jamal straightened his shoulders. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady. No, Your Honor, this is justice. Whitmore's lips twitched, but he said nothing. Harrison, however, wasn't done. He shook his head, still playing the part of the rational adult in the room. Your Honor, this is absurd. A minor, especially one with no legal training, cannot possibly defend himself adequately in a criminal case. That's not true, a voice called from the back. All eyes turned toward Sophia Bennett, who stood up with a folded document in hand. She walked toward the front of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the marble floor. In the state of Alabama, she said, handing the paper to the clerk, a defendant can waive legal representation if they can prove they have not received fair counsel. She glanced at Jamal, then at Whitmore. Given the fact that his court-appointed attorney advised him to plead guilty without reviewing evidence, I'd say he qualifies. Jamal turned back to Whitmore. So, do I have the right to defend myself or not? The judge studied him, his fingers tapping against the bench. A long, tense silence stretched over the courtroom. Then, finally, Whitmore let out a slow breath. Fine, he said, but you'll be under strict supervision. Any misstep, any disruption, and this privilege is revoked. Jamal nodded. Understood. Harrison didn't look pleased, but he didn't argue. Instead, he leaned forward, watching Jamal like a predator sizing up prey. All right, then, he said, smiling slightly. Let's see what you've got. Jamal had spent every moment since that hearing studying. He didn't have a law degree, but he had something just as powerful, a sharp mind and the ability to see cracks in a story. And right now, he was looking at a document that had too many of them. It was the police report from the day of his arrest. The pages were clean, professional, but something felt off. He read the section about his detainment over and over. The officers claimed they arrested him at 3:45 p.m., but he remembered checking the clock on the school wall right before they grabbed him. It had been 3:53. That didn't make sense. And then there was another problem. One of the officers, a man named Daniels, had written that Jamal was acting aggressive and had to be restrained. But the school cameras, even the tampered ones, didn't show that. Jamal exhaled slowly. They had lied, and he was going to prove it. The next day in court, Jamal stood at the defense table, his palms flat against the surface. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to question Officer Daniels." Harrison gave a short laugh. "This should be interesting." Whitmore waved his hand. "Proceed." Daniels took the stand, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. Jamal walked up slowly. "Officer Daniels, in your report, you wrote that I was arrested at 3:45 p.m. Is that correct?" Daniels nodded. "That's what's in the report." Jamal turned and gestured toward the clock on the courtroom wall. "That's interesting, because I checked the time before I was taken into custody. It was 3:53. Daniels' jaw tightened. "Maybe your memory's off." Jamal held up the police report. "Or maybe yours is." The courtroom stirred. Whitmore's gaze darkened, but he didn't stop Jamal. Harrison, however, leaned forward. "Objection. This is irrelevant." Jamal turned to him. "How is the time of my arrest irrelevant? If they can't even get that right, what else are they lying about?" Harrison didn't respond. Jamal turned back to Daniels. "In your report, you also wrote that I was aggressive and had to be restrained. But as far as I know, there's no video evidence supporting that." Daniels swallowed. Jamal took a step closer. "So let me ask you this, if I was so dangerous, where are the neutral witnesses? The teachers? The students who weren't Ethan's friends?" Silence. For the first time since the trial began, Daniels looked uncomfortable. Whitmore cleared his throat. "Officer, answer the question." Daniels shifted in his seat. I don't recall any neutral witnesses." Jamal tilted his head. "So you're telling me I was aggressive in a crowded hallway, and yet, the only people who saw it were Ethan Whitmore's friends?" The tension in the courtroom was thick. Jamal pressed forward. "Officer Daniels, did you write this report yourself?" Daniels hesitated. That hesitation was everything. Harrison saw it too. His eyes narrowed as he shot a look at Daniels. A silent warning. Jamal didn't let up. "Or was it given to you? Already written?" Daniels' lips parted, but before he could answer, Harrison stood abruptly. "That's enough." Jamal turned to him. "You seem nervous, Mr. Harrison." Harrison's expression darkened. "I assure you, I'm not." Jamal smirked. "We'll see about that." Outside the courthouse, Lorraine Carter pulled her phone from her purse. A message had just come in from an unknown number. "Tell your son to back down, or everyone pays the price." Her heart pounded. She looked up toward the courthouse steps, where Jamal was standing tall, talking to Sophia and Elijah. He was winning, and that meant someone was scared. Jamal Carter knew the system would push back. He just hadn't expected it to happen so fast. The next morning, as he sat in the courtroom, he felt the shift in the air. Something was different. Victor Harrison walked in with a certain swagger, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Jamal didn't like it. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Mr. Harrison, the court understands you have new evidence?" Harrison stood. "That's correct, Your Honor." He turned toward Jamal, his expression almost smug. "We have obtained a new piece of surveillance footage from St. Augustine Academy. While it's not a complete video, it does contain an image of the defendant near the alleged altercation." Jamal stiffened. This wasn't possible. The original footage had been altered, he knew that. Harrison held up a grainy, black and white photograph. It was a still frame from the security footage, capturing a blurry figure in the school hallway. The outline looked like Jamal. The timestamp placed it moments before Ethan had claimed he was attacked. Jamal clenched his jaw. "That doesn't prove anything." Harrison chuckled. "That's for the court to decide." Then came the real blow. "We also have a new witness." A man stepped forward. Mr. Bradshaw, a history teacher at St. Augustine. He was well respected, strict, and had been working there for over a decade. "Mr. Bradshaw," Harrison said smoothly, "you were in the hallway at the time of the incident, correct?" Bradshaw hesitated. His fingers twitched slightly before he nodded. "Yes, I was." "And what did you see?" Bradshaw swallowed. His eyes flickered toward Jamal for the briefest second before he spoke. I saw Jamal lunge at Ethan. It looked aggressive. Jamal's stomach dropped. Lies. This was a setup. He turned toward his mother, sitting behind him in the courtroom. Lorraine Carter's face was a mask of quiet rage, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. She knew the truth. They all did. But the truth wasn't always enough. Elijah Green had spent the past 24 hours doing what he did best, digging. Sitting in his bedroom, he scrolled through old backups of the school's security footage, hidden away on a forgotten server. And then, he found it. The original, unaltered video. Heart-pounding. He clicked to download it. Halfway through, his screen flickered. Then it went black. His heart stopped. A message appeared. You're playing with fire. The laptop powered down completely. The hard drive whirred, then went silent. Elijah stared at the blank screen, his breath coming fast. Someone had just hacked him. This wasn't just about hiding the footage. This was about control. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to win a case. They were making sure no one ever uncovered the truth. Elijah grabbed his phone and dialed Sophia. We have a problem. Lorraine Carter walked into work that morning expecting a fight. She hadn't expected to be fired. Her supervisor wouldn't even look her in the eye. I'm sorry, Lorraine. We have to let you go. She didn't even get an explanation. No warnings. No mistakes on her record. She had worked there for 8 years. This wasn't a coincidence. The system wasn't just after Jamal. They were coming for her, too. Sophia Bennett wasn't an easy woman to scare. But when she stepped out of her apartment that morning and spotted the black SUV parked across the street, she felt something shift in her stomach. She wasn't paranoid. She had been followed before. But this was different. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Walk away, or you'll regret it. She stared at the message. Then, slowly, she turned back toward her apartment and shut the door. If they thought she was going to back down, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Jamal sat alone in the holding area of the courthouse, staring at the wall. Everything was crashing down. They had planted false evidence. They had bribed a teacher. They had silenced the truth. And now, his mother was paying the price. It wasn't just about him anymore. He felt the anger bubbling inside him. Sharp and cold. He had spent his whole life following the rules, believing in fairness, in justice. But justice wasn't real, not for people like him. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. When he looked up, he was surprised to see Ethan Whitmore standing there. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan shifted on his feet. He hesitated, then sighed. Forget it. He turned to leave. Jamal's voice was quiet but firm. You know the truth, don't you? Ethan froze. Jamal stared at him, his eyes burning with something dangerous. You know I didn't touch you. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fingers curled into fists. Jamal took a slow step forward. You think this is going to go away? That your dad can fix this like he fixes everything else? Ethan swallowed hard. Jamal's voice was low. You're just as trapped as I am. The difference is, I'm willing to fight. Ethan's eyes flickered with something. Fear? Guilt? Regret? Then he turned and walked away. Jamal exhaled sharply, watching him go. There was more to this. Ethan was hiding something, and Jamal was going to find out what. That night, Sophia sat at her desk, flipping through case files. Then she saw it. A document buried deep in an old report. A list of cases handled by Judge Whitmore and Prosecutor Harrison. And every single one of them had something in common: defendants who were young, black, and easy to convict. This wasn't just about Jamal. This had been happening for years. Her phone buzzed. Jamal's voice was quiet but steady. What did you find? Sophia took a breath. Proof. Jamal closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were filled with cold determination. They picked the wrong person to blame. The library was nearly empty, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the tall windows. Jamal sat at a corner table, flipping through a thick book on constitutional law, not because he was studying, but because he needed something to focus on, something to keep his mind from spiraling. The case was tightening around him. Every time he thought he had an opening, Harrison or Whitmore found a way to slam the door shut. The evidence was stacked against him. His mother had lost her job, and Elijah had been hacked just for trying to uncover the truth. He was running out of options. Then a voice broke through his thoughts. We need to talk. Jamal's head snapped up. Ethan Whitmore stood a few feet away, shifting uneasily. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong in his own skin. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something else, something that almost looked like fear. Jamal narrowed his eyes. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here. Ethan hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. I know you didn't do it, he said quietly. Jamal felt his pulse spike. He had imagined this moment so many times, hearing those words from Ethan's mouth. But now that it was happening, he didn't trust it. He leaned forward. Then why the hell have you been lying? Ethan's jaw tightened. He glanced around the library, as if making sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. Because if I tell the truth, I lose everything. Jamal scoffed. And what? I'm just supposed to sit here and take the fall for you? Ethan rubbed his hands together, his gaze darting toward the exit. You don't get it, Carter. My dad, he doesn't just run a courtroom. He runs everything. He swallowed hard. If I go against him, I won't just be disappointing him. I'll be turning my back on my entire family. Jamal clenched his fists under the table. So you'd rather let an innocent person go down than stand up to your father? Ethan didn't answer. Jamal's voice dropped, laced with something cold. How many times has he done this? Ethan's breath hitched slightly. Jamal pressed on. How many people before me? How many kids had their lives ruined just because your dad decided they were guilty before the trial even started? Ethan's face paled. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan pushed back his chair and stood. I can't, he muttered, shaking his head. I can't. Jamal stared at him, fury rising in his chest. If you walk away from this, he said, his voice like steel, you're just as bad as him. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, his face twisting in conflict. Then he turned and walked out. Jamal watched him go, his heart pounding. Ethan was scared, and that meant he knew something. Jamal just had to figure out how to make him talk. Sophia Bennett wasn't afraid of much. She had spent years digging into corruption, exposing dirty cops, and taking on powerful people who wanted her to shut up. But Thomas Briggs was different. She met the former officer at a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. He sat in the back booth, his eyes constantly flicking toward the door like he was expecting someone to come for him. She slid into the seat across from him. Appreciate you meeting me. Briggs let out a dry chuckle. If I had any sense, I wouldn't be here. Sophia leaned in. Tell me what you know. Briggs hesitated. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I used to work under Harrison, he admitted, back when he was climbing the ranks in the DA's office. Even then, he was pulling strings, making cases disappear, planting evidence when it suited him. His voice turned bitter. And Whitmore? He's been covering for him the whole time. Sophia's stomach twisted. She had suspected it, but hearing it out loud made it real. Briggs shook his head. This case you're looking into? It's just one of many. They've been doing this for years, locking up kids who can't fight back, making sure the system works in their favor. She pulled out her recorder. Will you go on the record? Briggs froze. Then he let out a harsh laugh. Lady, if I go on the record, I won't live long enough to see it published. Sophia frowned. You really think it's that dangerous? Briggs leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. You ever hear about Detective Morales? Sophia's blood ran cold. Morales had been a cop in Birmingham a few years back. He had been investigating corruption in the legal system. Then one night, he drove off the road. Official cause of death? Drunk driving. Except Morales didn't drink. Briggs met her eyes. You dig too deep, and they'll bury you. Sophia swallowed hard. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down. An email. No sender. No subject line. She opened it. It was a file. A list of names. Dozens of them. Each name had a case number beside it. Cases handled by Harrison and Whitmore. Cases just like Jamal's. At the bottom of the email, there was a single line of text. Stop now, or the next name on this list will be yours. Sophia inhaled sharply. Briggs saw her expression and shook his head. You need to walk away. Sophia clenched her jaw. She wasn't walking away. She was going all in. Jamal sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the list Sophia had given him. These weren't just names. They were lives. People who had been railroaded by the same system that was trying to destroy him. He had started this fight to prove his own innocence. But now, he was fighting for something bigger. He wasn't just going to defend himself. He was going to take them all down. Jamal Carter had never been good at waiting. He paced his small bedroom, his mind racing through every possible move. The weight of everything, the case, the corruption, his mother's job, even Sophia being targeted, pressed down on him like a heavy chain. But right now, none of it mattered as much as one thing. Ethan Whitmore. If Ethan testified, this whole case could flip overnight. The lies, the cover-ups, it could all come crashing down. But if Ethan stayed silent, Jamal would be walking into court with nothing but his word against a system built to crush him. He exhaled sharply and grabbed his jacket. It was time to make a move. Ethan's house was massive, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Tall iron gates, perfectly trimmed hedges, a long driveway leading up to a mansion that didn't feel like a home. More like a fortress. Jamal didn't bother knocking on the front door. He knew Ethan wasn't the type to let him in that way. Instead, he made his way around the side of the house, to the back patio where he had seen Ethan sneak out before during school events. Sure enough, after a few minutes, the door cracked open. Ethan stepped out, pulling his hoodie over his head. His face was tense. What do you want? Jamal crossed his arms. You know what I want. Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I already told you. I'm not here to beg. Jamal cut in. His voice was firm, steady. I'm here to make you choose. Ethan frowned. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Jamal took a step closer. You can spend the rest of your life in your dad's shadow, doing what he tells you, pretending you don't see what he's doing. Or, his eyes locked onto Ethan's. Or you can do the right thing. Ethan let out a sharp laugh. But it wasn't amused. It was bitter. You think it's that simple? You think I want to be part of this? His hands clenched into fists. I don't want any of this, Carter. But if I go against my dad, you won't just be going against him. Jamal interrupted. You'll be going against everything he stands for. He took another step. But tell me something. If you keep quiet, if you let me take the fall, how many more kids do you think he's going to do this to? Ethan's face twisted, like something inside him was breaking apart. Jamal lowered his voice. You don't have to be a hero. You just have to tell the truth. For a long time, Ethan said nothing. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back inside, shutting the door behind him. Jamal clenched his jaw. Ethan was scared. But scared people could still make the right choice. Sophia Bennett knew she was being followed. She had been doing this job long enough to recognize the feeling, the prickle at the back of her neck. The way certain cars showed up on the same streets. The subtle shift in the air when someone was watching. She had ignored it at first, chalked it up to paranoia. But tonight, when she stepped into her apartment, she knew she had been wrong. The door was unlocked. Her stomach turned to ice. She had locked it before she left. Slowly, she pushed it open. The living room looked normal. Nothing broken, nothing missing. But as she stepped further inside, she saw it. A message, scrawled across her bathroom mirror in red marker. You know too much. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her phone and dialed Jamal. He answered immediately. What's wrong? They were here. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. Someone broke in. They didn't take anything. They just left me a message. Silence. Then Jamal's voice, low and serious. You need to get out of there. Sophia exhaled sharply. No, this just means we're getting too close. If they're trying to scare me, that means they're desperate. Jamal hesitated. We have to be careful. We don't have time to be careful. Sophia closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Jamal, we need to go public with this. Now. No. Jamal said immediately. Not yet. Sophia frowned. Why the hell not? Because if we move too soon, they'll destroy the evidence before we can use it. Jamal's voice was firm. We have one shot at this, and we have to make it count. Sophia clenched her jaw. Then we better move fast. Jamal had barely hung up the phone when it rang again. Unknown number. His stomach tightened. He hesitated, then answered. Who is this? Ethan's voice came through the line. Quiet but urgent. I need to see you. Now. Jamal sat up straighter. What's going on? Ethan hesitated. I think I'm ready to talk. Jamal grabbed his hoodie. Where? Corner of Sycamore and 5th. In 15 minutes. Jamal nodded, already heading for the door. I'm on my way. He didn't notice the dark sedan parked a few houses down, or the way its headlights flickered on the moment he stepped outside. As Jamal walked toward the meeting spot, the city around him felt quieter than usual. Too quiet. He kept his head down, his hands in his pockets, trying to ignore the unease creeping up his spine. Then, up ahead, a car slowed to a stop. The back door opened. Jamal froze. Someone stepped out, a figure in a dark suit. And then, before Jamal could react, the car's headlights flared, blinding him. His pulse slammed against his ribs. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't safe. Jamal Carter knew he was being followed. He had felt it the second he stepped out of his house. The low hum of an engine idling just a little too long. The subtle movement of a shadow from across the street. The black sedan had been tailing him for at least 4 blocks now. Keeping just far enough to avoid suspicion but close enough to make sure he noticed. He exhaled slowly, keeping his pace steady. He couldn't go back home. If they knew where he lived, and they definitely did, there was no telling what they would do next. He had already seen what they were willing to do to Sophia. To his mother. He wasn't going to lead them straight to his front door. His fingers tightened around his phone as he pressed speed dial. Elijah answered on the second ring. Yo, where you at? Jamal kept his voice low. I'm being followed. There was a beat of silence before Elijah swore under his breath. You sure? Jamal glanced at the sedan again. It hadn't turned at the last light, it was waiting for him. Yeah, I'm sure. Elijah's tone sharpened. You got a plan? Jamal's jaw clenched. If anything happens to me, tell Sophia. Don't say it like that. Man, I don't like that. I'll be fine. Elijah let out a frustrated sigh. Be careful. Jamal hung up. He had bigger things to focus on now. The meeting spot was just ahead, a small, run-down park behind the school. The kind of place where kids used to hang out before the administration put up cameras everywhere. But here, hidden behind the old swing set, was Ethan Whitmore. Ethan looked different tonight. Gone was the arrogant smirk, the careless posture. Instead, he looked nervous, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his eyes darting around like he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. Jamal stopped a few feet away. Ethan exhaled. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Jamal watched him carefully. It's not about what I need. It's about what's right. Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges of his sleeves. You don't get it. If I talk, your dad already made his choice. Jamal interrupted. Now it's time for you to make yours. Ethan swallowed hard, his face conflicted. Then, before he could answer, movement flickered from the corner of Jamal's vision. 2 men stepped out from the darkness. Jamal recognized one immediately, the same officer who had arrested him outside St. Augustine. The other man, though, was new, a sharp suit, a calm expression, but the way he moved, the way he studied them both, made it clear. He worked for Harrison. Good evening, boys, the suited man said smoothly. We were just having a little chat with your father. Ethan, he's quite the powerful man. Ethan stiffened beside him. The officer smirked. And powerful men don't like loose ends. Jamal squared his shoulders. You're here to scare us. The suited man raised an eyebrow. No, Jamal, we're here to make sure Ethan understands what's at stake. Ethan's breathing hitched. What do you mean? The man smiled. It was the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be reassuring. If you open your mouth in court, Ethan, you won't just be betraying your father. You'll be making an enemy out of the very people who built this city. Jamal's fists clenched. Screw your city. The officer laughed. That's cute, kid. But Ethan looked shaken. His hands trembled slightly. His gaze locked onto the ground. Jamal could see it happening, the war inside him. The part of him that wanted to do the right thing. And the part of him that had spent his whole life being told what to do. Who to be. Jamal leaned in. Ethan, don't listen to them. This is what they do. They control people through fear. Ethan's breath was uneven. I can't. Jamal's chest tightened. Yes, you can. The officer took a step forward. Think carefully, Ethan. Your father can protect you, for now. But once you cross this line, you're on your own. Jamal turned to him. You're a coward, he said coldly. The man didn't flinch. No, Jamal, I'm a realist. And right now, reality is that you are going to lose. Then, before Jamal could react, Ethan's fist slammed into his jaw. The impact sent Jamal stumbling backward, pain exploding across his face as he hit the ground hard. He tasted blood. Ethan was panting, his hands shaking as he took a step back. His face was twisted with guilt. But his eyes were full of fear. I'm sorry, Ethan whispered. Then he turned and walked away. Jamal lay there for a moment, staring up at the dark sky. The officer chuckled. Guess that settles that. The suited man adjusted his cufflinks. It was a valiant effort, Jamal, but you lost. Jamal wiped the blood from his lip and sat up slowly, his head still ringing. Then he did something that made both men pause. He smiled. You really think I didn't see this coming? The officer's smirk faltered. Jamal reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and sent a single text. Activate Plan B. Somewhere across the city, Sophia Bennett received the message, and in her hands was the recording that would change everything. Jamal met the officer's gaze, his voice steady despite the pain. You think I lost? He wiped the blood from his chin. Nah, the game's just getting started. Sophia Bennett didn't hesitate. She had spent years chasing corruption, exposing half-truths that barely made a dent in the system. But this was different. This was a firestorm waiting to happen. She sat at her desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she attached the audio file to an email. She had triple-checked everything, made sure there was no way they could dismiss this as fake. The subject line was simple. Exclusive. Leaked audio reveals judicial corruption in Birmingham case. The recipients? Every major news outlet in the country. She hovered over the send button for a second. Then, exhaling sharply, she clicked it. There was no turning back now. The impact was immediate. Within minutes, Twitter was flooded with the hashtag Justice for Jamal. News anchors interrupted their scheduled programming with breaking reports. Websites crashed under the weight of traffic. The recording was damning. A clear conversation between Judge Whitmore and Prosecutor Harrison, discussing how to frame Jamal to protect Ethan. How they had orchestrated every step, from the falsified reports to the coerced testimony. We can't afford to let this case blow up. Harrison's voice sneered. The boy takes the fall. End of discussion. The outrage was instant. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Protesters gathered outside, chanting Jamal's name. The public, once passive, now demanded action. Victor Harrison reacted immediately, standing in front of a podium, cameras flashing. He smiled that politicians smile. This so-called evidence is nothing more than a smear campaign. He declared, there are forces out there that want to undermine the justice system. And I will not stand for it. But Sophia had been ready for this. Before he even finished his statement, another story broke. A retired police officer, Thomas Briggs, came forward. On live television, he looked directly into the camera and spoke. I worked under Victor Harrison for years. I saw firsthand how he twisted cases, planted evidence, destroyed families. This isn't the first time. It won't be the last, unless we stop him. Harrison's confident smirk wavered. The tide was turning. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Jamal sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. This was it, the moment he had been fighting for. Across from him, Victor Harrison looked the same as always, calm, composed, but something in his eyes had changed. He knew he was losing control. The judge cleared his throat. We will now resume the hearing of Jamal Carter. Jamal stood, his heart pounded, but his voice was steady. Your Honor, before we proceed, I would like to call a witness. Harrison immediately rose. Objection. The defense cannot introduce a new witness without prior notice. Jamal didn't flinch. Actually, Your Honor, according to the Alabama Rules of Evidence, a witness can be introduced if their testimony directly impacts the integrity of the case. The judge narrowed his eyes. And who is this witness? Jamal turned toward the gallery. A figure stood. Ethan Whitmore. Gasps rippled through the room. Harrison's jaw tightened. Ethan looked pale, like he might pass out right then and there. But his steps were steady as he approached the stand. The bailiff swore him in. "Do you swear to tell the truth? The whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I do." Jamal met his eyes. "Ethan, do you have anything to say about what happened that day?" For a long moment, Ethan didn't speak. His fingers clenched around the edge of the witness stand. His father, Judge Whitmore, sat frozen, his face a mask of fury and fear. Then, Ethan took a deep breath. "I lied." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan's voice was stronger this time. "Jamal didn't attack me. He never touched me. My father, he told me what to say. He said if I didn't, our family would suffer." Jamal didn't move. The words felt heavy, like they carried the weight of every injustice he had suffered. But Ethan wasn't done. "I'm sorry." His voice broke. "I should have told the truth sooner." Harrison shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." The witness. The judge slammed his gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Harrison." Harrison clenched his jaw, but he obeyed. Jamal took a slow breath. He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, with this testimony, it's clear I was falsely accused. I request that all charges be dropped immediately." The judge didn't answer right away. He looked at Ethan, then at Harrison, then finally at Jamal. He exhaled sharply and nodded. "The court will take a recess to review the new evidence. This hearing is temporarily adjourned." The gavel slammed down. Jamal let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time since this nightmare began, it felt like he was winning. The courtroom was silent. Jamal sat at the defense table, his hands resting calmly in front of him. But inside, his heart was pounding, not with fear, but with determination. Across from him, Victor Harrison leaned back in his chair, his usual smirk faltering. The once untouchable prosecutor was beginning to crack, and Jamal was about to break him completely. The judge cleared his throat. "We will now resume the trial of Jamal Carter." Jamal rose from his seat. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I would like to submit new evidence into the record." Harrison immediately stood. "Objection. The defense cannot introduce new evidence at this stage without prior notice." Jamal didn't even blink. "Actually, Your Honor, under Alabama state law, newly discovered evidence that directly impacts the validity of the charges can be submitted at any time before sentencing." The judge turned to Jamal. "What evidence are you presenting?" Jamal motioned toward Elijah, who was seated in the gallery. Elijah nodded and pulled out a flash drive. "This," Jamal said, "is the original, unedited surveillance footage from St. Augustine High School. The footage that proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was falsely accused." Gasps filled the courtroom. Harrison's face darkened. The judge gestured to the bailiff. "Play the footage." The courtroom's projector flickered to life. The video began. It showed Ethan Whitmore standing by his locker. Moments later, Jamal walked by, carrying his books. Ethan called out to him, his expression taunting. Jamal stopped but didn't react aggressively. Then, Ethan shoved Jamal. Jamal stumbled back but didn't retaliate. Then, the real moment of truth. Ethan punched himself in the face. A collective gasp rippled through the room. He clutched his nose, dropped to the floor, and began yelling for help. His friends rushed over, looking confused at first, then nodding along with his frantic story. The screen froze. Silence. Then, chaos erupted. Murmurs turned into full-blown outrage. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. People in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief. The judge banged his gavel. "Order. I will have order in this courtroom." Jamal turned to Harrison. "You were willing to throw me away for this?" Harrison's jaw tightened, but he wasn't done yet. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "I move to strike this footage from the record. We have no way of verifying its authenticity. This could have been fabricated by the defense." Jamal had expected this. "Your Honor, I anticipated that the prosecution would claim this, which is why I also brought an expert witness." The doors to the courtroom opened, and a woman in a suit walked in. Dr. Natalie Chong, forensic digital analyst. She has reviewed this footage and can confirm its authenticity. Harrison's expression soured. Dr. Chong took the stand, and after being sworn in, she looked directly at the judge. "This video has not been tampered with." The metadata confirms it was recorded on the day of the incident and was stored in the school system until it was altered. What Jamal Carter and his team have presented is the original footage. More murmurs. The judge rubbed his temple, looking at Harrison. Mr. Harrison, do you have a response? Harrison clenched his jaw. This proves nothing. Jamal smirked. It proves everything. The judge sighed. I will deliberate on this matter. We will take a recess before issuing a ruling. As people stood to stretch, Lorraine Carter made her way over to Jamal. Baby, you're doing it. You're proving them wrong. Jamal exhaled. Not yet, but we're close. Elijah came up beside him. Man, that was insane. Did you see Harrison's face? He looked like he swallowed a lemon. Jamal chuckled, but his eyes flickered toward Harrison. The prosecutor wasn't rattled. He was plotting. And that's what worried Jamal. When court resumed, the judge sat heavily in his chair. After reviewing the footage and testimony, I find that there is substantial reason to believe that Jamal Carter was falsely accused. Therefore, the charges against him are officially dropped. A roar of approval burst through the room. Jamal closed his eyes for a brief second, letting the relief wash over him. But when he opened them, his focus sharpened, because he wasn't done yet. The judge turned to Harrison. Mr. Harrison, this court will be reviewing your conduct in this case. There will be a formal investigation into whether prosecutorial misconduct took place. Harrison let out a slow breath and then smiled. Not a nervous smile, a knowing one. Your Honor, he said smoothly, this trial may be over, but the game has just begun. Jamal narrowed his eyes. I don't think you understand. Mr. Harrison, the judge snapped. This is not a game. And your career is now under scrutiny. Harrison tilted his head. We'll see about that. He stood and adjusted his suit. Then turned to Jamal. You think you won? He murmured. Jamal met his gaze head on. No, I know I did. The courtroom emptied out, but Jamal remained seated, his mind racing. Lorraine put a hand on his shoulder. You okay? Jamal nodded. Yeah, just thinking. Elijah sat next to him. Dude, you just took down one of the most powerful men in this city. What's left to think about? Jamal exhaled. Because Harrison isn't scared. Sophia, who had been quiet until now, crossed her arms. He should be. His career is on the line. Jamal shook his head. No, he has something else. Something bigger. A silence settled between them. Then, Sophia's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face paled. Jamal, she whispered, you need to see this. She turned the screen toward him. A leaked document, a list of cases Harrison had worked on. And at the very bottom, a single note. Subject: Jamal Carter. Status: not over. Jamal felt a chill creep down his spine. He had won this battle. But the war? It was far from over. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation. Jamal stood at the center of it all, his hands gripping the edges of the defendant's table. But he wasn't the one on trial anymore. The tables had turned. Across the room, Victor Harrison adjusted his tie, trying to maintain his composure. But Jamal could see it, the slight tension in his shoulders, the flicker of unease in his eyes. He knew, and for the first time, he was afraid. Jamal took a deep breath and turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence. The judge raised an eyebrow. Proceed. Sophia Bennett stepped forward, holding a thick folder. This, she said, her voice clear and firm, is a compiled list of cases overseen by Victor Harrison in the past 10 years. And within these files, there is a disturbing pattern. The judge motioned for her to continue. She opened the folder and projected scanned documents onto the courtroom screen. Names and case numbers filled the space, each one marked with a red flag. These are individuals who were prosecuted under suspicious circumstances, false confessions, missing evidence, coerced testimonies. Many of these cases share one thing in common: racial bias and a rushed conviction process. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jamal turned his gaze to Harrison. These aren't just cases, are they? These are people. People whose lives you destroyed. Harrison clenched his jaw. This is absurd. These are conspiracy theories. Nothing more. Jamal smirked. Is it? Sophia continued. We have testimonies from former officers, legal clerks, and even a judge who claimed they were pressured or manipulated into securing guilty verdicts. And one of them is here today. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Thomas Briggs walked in. The former officer, now retired, looked older than his years, worn down by the weight of the things he had done. He stepped up to the stand, took his oath, and cleared his throat. I was a cop for 25 years. I did my job. I believed in the system. But I also knew that sometimes that system didn't work the way it should. Jamal watched as Briggs' gaze landed on Harrison. I was ordered to tamper with evidence in multiple cases. At first, I told myself it was for the greater good. But eventually, I realized it was all about power. It was about keeping certain people down, while letting others go free. Briggs let out a long breath. I'm here to make it right. Silence. Then, the judge spoke. Mr. Harrison, do you have anything to say in response? Harrison scoffed. This is a joke. This kid, this child, thinks he can come in here and dismantle an entire system? You're all letting a child dictate the course of justice? Jamal met his eyes. No, Mr. Harrison, I'm not dismantling justice. I'm restoring it. The judge sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. Given the weight of the evidence, I have no choice but to dismiss all charges against Jamal Carter and request an immediate independent investigation into the actions of Victor Harrison. Cheers erupted from the back of the courtroom. Lorraine Carter gasped, covering her mouth with her hands before rushing forward to embrace her son. Elijah clapped loudly, letting out a relieved, "Hell yeah," while Sophia exhaled, her expression triumphant but cautious. Ethan Whitmore, standing in the farthest corner, turned and walked away without a word. But Jamal wasn't focused on any of them. His eyes were locked on Harrison. Because Harrison wasn't done, two officers approached and grabbed Harrison's arms, preparing to escort him out. But before they could, he turned, his gaze fixed on Jamal. You think this is over? His voice was low, venomous. You think you've won? Jamal tilted his head. I know I have. Harrison let out a bitter laugh as the officers began to pull him toward the exit. You're so naive. You think I'm the only one? You think I did all of this alone? You're just a kid. You have no idea how deep this goes. Jamal didn't flinch. Then I guess I have more work to do. Harrison's eyes darkened. You don't know what you've started. Jamal simply crossed his arms. No, Mr. Harrison, you don't know what I've started. The doors swung open, and Harrison was gone. Jamal let out a breath, his shoulders finally relaxing. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on him was lighter. But it wasn't gone. Sophia came up beside him. That was a hell of a fight. Kid. Jamal nodded. Yeah, but I don't think it's the last one. She studied him for a moment. You're not going to stop, are you? Jamal glanced at the empty defendant's chair, the place where he had once sat, accused and powerless. Then he looked at the judge's bench. And he knew, not until the system stops too. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, staring at the case files Sophia had printed out. The words blurred together, but the message was clear. Victor Harrison was just a piece of something much bigger. His mother, Lorraine, stood behind him, arms crossed tightly. You did what you set out to do. Baby, that man's going to prison. Isn't that enough? Jamal swallowed hard. What if it's not? Lorraine exhaled, placing a hand on his shoulder. Jamal, I know you want justice. But these people? They don't play fair. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. Hello? A smooth, controlled voice spoke. Jamal Carter. We haven't met, but I represent Mr. Harrison's interests. Jamal's grip on the phone tightened. Harrison doesn't have any interests anymore. A low chuckle. That's where you're wrong. My client has information. Information that could benefit you. We'd like to make an arrangement. Lorraine leaned in, listening. What kind of arrangement? Jamal asked. You stop looking. You enjoy your win. And in return, Harrison will take a reduced sentence, one that ensures this whole situation fades quietly into the past. Lorraine snatched the phone from his hand. You think you can bribe my son? Not a bribe, Ms. Carter. A warning. The voice remained eerily calm. You've done enough. If you keep pushing, you won't like what happens next. The call ended. Silence stretched between them before Lorraine muttered. These people don't stop, Jamal. They just change the rules. Jamal stared at the phone, his mind racing. Harrison was in custody, but someone still had power. Someone who thought they could control the outcome. He wasn't done. Sophia Bennett sat at her desk, a fresh stack of papers in front of her. The deeper she dug, the clearer it became. Harrison wasn't working alone. Her email chimed. Unknown sender. Stop now. This fight is bigger than you. She leaned back, heartbeat quickening. A second email arrived, this time with an attachment. A transaction receipt. She clicked it open. $500 transferred to a private account. The recipient. Judge Charles Whitmore. Sophia's breath caught. She picked up her phone and dialed Jamal. You need to see this. Elijah paced around his bedroom, typing furiously on his laptop. He had hacked into public financial records before. But this was different. Someone had tried to erase this transaction. But he was faster. When he pulled up the final details, his stomach twisted. Whitmore had been paid off just minutes after Harrison was taken in. He called Jamal immediately. Dude, we've got a problem. Jamal rubbed his forehead. We already knew Whitmore was dirty. No, man, this is different. Elijah lowered his voice. Someone's funding him. Someone powerful. A chill ran down Jamal's spine. Send me everything you have. That night, Jamal sat in his room, looking at the files spread across his bed. Harrison was a puppet. Whitmore was pulling strings. But who was holding the strings above Whitmore? His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He let it ring. Then, a text appeared. You don't want to know what happens to kids who don't stay in their lane. Jamal exhaled slowly, staring at the words. They think I'll be scared. He reached for his laptop. They're wrong. Jamal sat at the edge of his bed, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The recording of Whitmore's confession was playing through his earbuds. Every word, every pause, every smug inflection, it was all there. Proof that justice wasn't about truth in this system. It was about power, and Whitmore held more of it than Jamal had ever imagined. A knock at his bedroom door made him jump. His mother stepped in, her face lined with exhaustion. Baby, you haven't eaten all day. Jamal shook his head. I can't stop now, Ma. This is bigger than me. Lorraine sighed, walking over to him. I know, but I also know you're up against people who don't play fair. Be careful. Jamal nodded, slipping his phone into his pocket. I will, I promise. Whitmore's office was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of leather and old paper. When Jamal entered, the judge was already seated behind his massive oak desk, fingers intertwined, a half smile on his face. You've gone further than I expected. Jamal, Whitmore said, his tone almost amused. Jamal didn't sit, and you've hidden more than I expected. The judge leaned back, studying him. Let's not pretend this is about truth. The system doesn't work that way. Justice? That's just a word people throw around when they think they have power. Jamal felt his pulse quicken. And you think you have power? Whitmore chuckled. No, I know I do, and I know how to use it. There was a beat of silence before the judge leaned forward. Let me offer you something. Jamal, a way out. Jamal didn't react, but his mind sharpened. Walk away. Whitmore continued, voice smooth. Forget this fight, and in return, I'll make sure your future is set. A scholarship, a chance to be something more than just another kid lost in the system. Jamal exhaled slowly. And if I don't? The smile faded. Then you'll find out just how deep this system can bury you. Jamal's fingers tightened in his pockets, where his phone was still recording. You think I'm scared? He asked quietly. Whitmore smirked. No, that's the problem. Jamal stepped out of the courthouse, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. He pulled out his phone, pressing stop on the recording. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. Then, headlights flared in the distance. His gut screamed at him. Move. Jamal dove just as the black SUV barreled toward him. Tires screeched. The engine roared. And in the last second, the vehicle swerved past, missing him by inches. His heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, watching the SUV disappear down the street. A message had been sent. He wiped his hands on his jeans, breath still ragged, and dialed Sophia. I have it, he said. We're going live tonight. Across town, in his own dimly lit office, Whitmore answered a call. A voice on the other end asked. He's still pushing? The judge's jaw tightened. It doesn't matter. I have a plan. Jamal sat on the worn-out couch in his living room, his fingers hovering over the send button on his phone. The recording of Whitmore's confession was ready to go live. Sophia had already leaked it to multiple news outlets. But this was different. This was him taking control of the narrative. A deep breath filled his lungs as he glanced at his mother, who sat across from him, watching him with quiet concern. You sure about this? Lorraine asked, her voice steady but laced with worry. Jamal nodded. Yeah, Ma, it's time. He pressed the button. Within minutes, the internet exploded. The recording spread like wildfire. News stations picked it up. Social media was ablaze with outrage. Civil rights groups issued statements demanding an investigation. Whitmore, once a revered judge, was now the center of a national scandal. Across town, in his office, Whitmore watched the chaos unfold on his television. His hands trembled as he reached for his glass of whiskey. But his grip faltered, spilling some onto the polished mahogany desk. His phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from political allies, journalists, lawyers. He ignored them all. He knew the walls were closing in. Then came the subpoena. He was being called to testify before the ethics committee. The hearing was a spectacle. Cameras lined the courtroom. Reporters whispered into microphones, and protesters filled the streets outside, demanding justice. Whitmore, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, took his seat at the stand. His expression was controlled, but a slight twitch in his jaw betrayed his unease. Judge Whitmore, the lead investigator, began. Do you deny any involvement in manipulating judicial proceedings for personal or political gain? Whitmore cleared his throat. These accusations are baseless. I have always upheld the law with the utmost integrity. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Then, a new voice spoke up. You're lying. The room turned toward the source, Ethan Whitmore. Jamal hadn't been sure if Ethan would show up. The last time they had spoken, Ethan was still torn between loyalty and truth. But here he was, standing in front of his father, looking him in the eye. Dad, I heard everything, Ethan said, his voice firm but shaken. I covered for you. I lied for you. But I can't keep doing it. Not after everything. Whitmore's face turned pale. Ethan took a deep breath before continuing. I was there when you talked about burying Jamal's case. I heard you tell Victor Harrison to make sure Jamal never had a chance. Gasps echoed through the room. Jamal felt something shift inside him, not just relief, but a sense of justice finally being served. The fallout was immediate. Whitmore was suspended indefinitely pending criminal investigation. The DOJ announced a formal inquiry into judicial corruption. Other judges and law enforcement officials tied to the conspiracy were named in subsequent reports. Outside the courthouse, Lorraine squeezed her son's hand. You did it, baby. But Jamal wasn't smiling. It's not over, Ma. Elijah had spent the last few days digging through financial records. Now, he stood next to Jamal, holding up his phone. Jay, he said, voice uneasy. We have a problem. On the screen was a recent transaction. Millions of dollars funneled into an unknown offshore account. Just days before Whitmore's arrest. The recipient? Not Whitmore. Someone higher. Jamal stared at the screen. A slow realization dawning. Whitmore was just a piece of the puzzle. There was still someone else out there, pulling the strings. Jamal sat in front of a sea of flashing cameras, the bright lights momentarily blinding him. Reporters shouted his name. Microphones pushed forward, each one eager to get the first word from the boy who had taken down a giant. But Jamal wasn't here to bask in victory. The interviewer, a woman in a crisp navy suit, leaned forward. Jamal, how does it feel to have won? He didn't hesitate. I didn't win, he said, his voice steady. I just opened a door. There are still so many like me, kids trapped in a system that was never built for them. This isn't the end. The room fell silent for a moment. Then, the murmurs started. This wasn't the response they had expected. Lorraine sat in the front row, pride and worry written all over her face. Sophia stood off to the side, arms crossed, nodding slightly in agreement. Elijah, despite his usual carefree attitude, watched the scene unfold with a knowing expression. Jamal wasn't done fighting. That night, in his tiny bedroom, Jamal stared at the ceiling. Everything had changed. He had spent so long just trying to clear his own name. But now he realized, his case was just a small piece of something bigger. He couldn't walk away, not when he knew there were others out there, suffering in silence. He grabbed his laptop and started typing. Mission statement. A new organization, dedicated to fighting judicial injustice for kids like him. A place where no one would be silenced. The next morning, Sophia read over his draft and smiled. Looks like you just found your real calling. Jamal smirked. Yeah, I guess I have. But not everything was over. Elijah burst through the front door. Out of breath, waving his phone. Jay, we got a problem. On the screen was a financial report, hidden transactions that Elijah had been tracking ever since Whitmore's fall. A massive deposit, a secret account, a name attached to it. Not Whitmore, not Harrison, someone else, someone bigger. Sophia took one look and cursed under her breath. This isn't over, is it? Jamal clenched his jaw. No, it's not. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You've stepped into something you shouldn't have. Consider this your only warning. Jamal looked up, his pulse steady. Through the window, a black car sat across the street. Engine running, headlights off. Someone was inside, watching, waiting. Lorraine walked into the room, took one look at Jamal's expression, and knew. Baby, what is it? He exhaled, folding the phone in his palm. Nothing, Ma, just another fight. Outside, the black car pulled away into the night. But Jamal knew, this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Justice isn't just about laws, it's about those brave enough to challenge them. Jamal Carter's fight proves that even the smallest voice can shake the system. But the real question is, how many more are still trapped in the shadows? Unheard? What would you do if the truth was right in front of you? But speaking it could cost everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to Shadow Secrets for more untold stories waiting to be uncovered.